Today we're going to look at the history of dictionaries and different forms that dictionaries can take. So far in this course, we've been looking at a lot of dictionaries, but largely as a monolithic kind of entity. We've been looking at Nelson's and not really talking about what other ways to organize a dictionary there might be. And in a way, whether what we get in Nelson's is typical or not, these are all questions that I'd like to address in this lesson. So when we think about the history of dictionaries and how dictionaries are formed in the first place, there are some key questions that we need to consider. First of all, how will people use the dictionary? For what purpose is it compiled? Second, what kind of information should that dictionary include so that it will serve the needs of the people who are going to use it? And third, how do you organize that dictionary? How do you make it easy for the user to manipulate and convenient for the user to manipulate based on what his or her needs are? So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and look at how dictionaries have developed from China and then into Japan. But before we get started doing that, I want to point out that what we're really talking about here is information literacy and how information is organized. These are things that we often take for granted, but if we put ourselves in a different context, we can understand how different structures might make sense. So first, and I'd like to give credit where credit is due, this comparison of words didn't come initially from me. It came from Sharon Domeyer, a librarian in Massachusetts. So thank you, Sharon. I want to point out that in Japanese, the word for dictionary, jiten, can actually be written a number of different ways. The most common way is what you see on your screen right here, using these two characters, and if you don't know them, if you're not familiar with them, I've given you the Nelson's entry for each one. The G is a word or a term or an expression or a sentence. And the ten is a rule or a set of rules, a law code. So a jiten, as we see here on this screen, would be a set of rules for words or terms, expressions, or sentences. What are the other possibilities? How about this jiten? That ji is kanji no ji, and it means a specific individual discrete character or a word. So a jiten like this would be a character dictionary as opposed to a word dictionary. Here's another possibility, also read jiten, and this ji stands for thing. It's kunyomi is koto. So a jiten like this would probably be more like an encyclopedia than it would a dictionary. So there's a lot of different ways to organize information. Let's look at what happened in early history and move forward chronologically. To give you an idea of what's going on around the world at the same time as the Chinese are developing their dictionaries, I'll give you a brief timeline here. There was a Chinese dictionary around the 3rd century BCE called the Arya, which was the earliest monolingual dictionary. In Greece, Apollonius the sophist wrote the oldest extant Greek lexicon around the 1st century CE, and that lists Homeric vocabulary and meanings. In Japan, dictionary development starts much later. Around 835 CE, the Tendai Bansho Meigi was created. This was a glossary of written Chinese, not of Japanese. But of course, classical Chinese was very important and commonly used in early Japan, so that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. So let's start with China to understand the development and different directions that dictionary development can take in its original land. To understand the history of dictionary development in China and consequently in Japan, we need to consider who is going to use the work. Why is the dictionary being compiled? Who's going to use it? And what are they going to use it for? To answer that question, we will look to the educational system. Traditional China had a particular approach to education, and if we understand that approach to education, we'll understand the development of dictionaries and the structure of early dictionaries. The nature of the written language, in other words, a language that's written in ideographs or ideograms, also conditions the content and the approach to the organization of dictionaries. So let's do a little bit of Chinese history here. In traditional China, the education system was quite different than what we're familiar with today. It circled on or centered on the memorization of a set of works, what we'll call the memorization corpus. Now, memorization today is often demonized, particularly in the American system. We usually append the adjective rote, memorization, rote, and we say it with anger and dismay. Because in modern pedagogy in the United States, memorization is seen as an improper way to approach education. But in traditional China, memorization was key. And as I go through the material, you'll see why. Early childhood education, in other words, before a child was about 8 years old, would entail memorization first of basic characters. And when I say memorization, I'm saying the ability to see the character on the page and say out loud how it's pronounced. That doesn't necessarily mean that someone could read that character and know what it meant, or see that character in context and understand the context. Here, memorization simply means recognizing it and being able to recite it. After the basic characters, students would then move on to memorization of primers. And those primers would have minimal repeats, which would make the memorization process perhaps a little bit less difficult. For example, some primers that we still have are the 1,000-character classic that dates to the 6th century and the 3-character classic to the 13th century. After a student had mastered those, he would move on to the memorization of the most important of the Confucian classics. Now, I don't have time to go over all the Confucian classics right now. I will be mentioning them later this semester in the unit on philosophy and philosophical resources. But to suffice it to say that there is a corpus of Confucian classics, a collection of books, not a book, but books. And memorizing those was important for the next step, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. So what do I mean by memorization of the Confucian classics? Again, the ability to recite those works without having the work in front of you. And then also, students would move on to the memorization of passages from histories. And I have capitalized histories here for a reason. These are formal dynastic histories, not just randomly chosen histories of somebody, whoever, right? And then, finally, students would memorize the great literary works, particularly the great works of poetry. Now, why would they be doing this? This is hard work, memorizing all this material. Well, there was a goal. The final goal was to take and to pass, or to take and do well, on the civil service examination. The civil service examination has its origins really back in the early Chinese history. It becomes quite central to the structure of court rank in the Tang. And the Japanese borrowed that whole idea about ranks and courtly social position. We'll get to that in a later unit. In the Chinese context, the civil service exam and the ability to serve in the civil service were the pinnacle of a good life. The best job you could possibly have would be a civil servant, and it was very competitive to take these exams and do well on them. The exams actually didn't have a whole lot to do with what you might expect. You hear the word civil servant, you might think, well, you know, office skills and that kind of thing. But no, the civil service exam was largely based on those materials that students had spent most of their childhood memorizing. So it was really important for these students to know that material inside and out, forward and back. Another goal of education is that if one were in the top echelons of society, one would be expected to be skilled at composing literature, composing poetry. If you couldn't do that, you were seen as a bit of a cretin, and you probably wouldn't fit in very well with society. So there's two major goals here. In composing those literary works, one would necessarily allude to some of the classics, to take some original poetry, put an interesting spin on it, and create a new work. And so again, memorization was important because remember, there's no easy reference resource beyond the dictionaries that we're going to be using. In those situations in which you're tempted to pull out your smartphone and just look something up on Wikipedia, that was impossible. In essence, memorizing the classics was like trying to cram the world of traditional China into a form, like a Wikipedia page, in your brain. So what were the needs of these students? They needed to know how the words and the phrases are used or have been used, where they were used, what classics, so they could look those up. And they needed to know how the words were pronounced. These were the three goals, the three needs of early Chinese learners of characters. Notice what the word means is not there. In other words, a definition is not there. We, in our context, think of dictionaries as necessarily providing definitions. Indeed, we often say, what's the dictionary definition of that? But in traditional China, definitions might show up, but not necessarily, because that wasn't a need of these early learners. So I mentioned the Arya. The Arya was one of the earliest dictionaries in the 3rd century BC. Arya means approaches to refinement. It is organized by category, not by radical, not by poetic rhyme, but by category. And it is today considered one of the 13 Confucian classics. The next dictionary I'll mention, and I have an example page from it, is the Shuowen Jiezi. Shuowen Jiezi means analyzing phrases and explaining characters. This dictionary is organized according to a system that has 514 radicals. Not 214, but 514. That's not a typo. Now, we have already talked about the Kangxi radicals, and I'm getting to that in just a second. But before I do, I'll point out that when we looked first at the Kangxi radicals, I mentioned that there were other ways, there were other systems developed before the Kangxi radicals by which characters could be organized in a dictionary, and the Shuowen Jiezi has one of those systems. The Ming Dynasty saw the introduction of the 214 radicals with which we are familiar, and the Kangxi Sidian was published in 1716. It standardized that system, the 214 radical system, and the Kangxi Sidian itself has about 47,000 characters in it. Here's a sample from the Shuowen. The Shuowen gives us an early calligraphic form of the character, and then it gives us a definition, something that people speak or eat with, and then it elaborates on it. And one can also drink with it. It has two sides, tongue at the bottom, all that. The Shuowen, as I said, dates to the 1st century AD. Now there's some other stuff in this entry, but I'm gonna hold off explaining that until we look at some later examples. So one of the things that we would expect to find in an entry of a traditional Chinese dictionary is, first of all, the pronunciation. And that is given using something that I'm going to call the flip cut system. That's not an official translation. That's just a translation of the two characters. I'm going to explain that on a subsequent slide, so just hold tight on that. Another thing you'd expect in an entry is citation of earlier usages. Where has that word or that character been used before? A third item you'd expect is the rhyme of the character. And that would be important for someone who is composing poetry. I should point out that in Japanese poetry, rhyme is not important. Meter is important, but rhyme is not important. However, in Chinese poetry, rhyme is very important. And actually, one of the things that's fascinating about it is that the official rhyme of every character was established early on in Chinese history. And despite the fact that over time, language changes, and I'll be saying more about that in a couple minutes, the official rhyme wouldn't change. So you might say to yourself, why would somebody need to know the rhyme of the character to say it out loud to be able to hear it, right? Wouldn't it be obvious? And the answer is not necessarily, because you might be somebody working in, say, the 15th century or the 16th century, but you need to know what that rhyme was from the 3rd century or the 4th century. And language has probably changed over that time. So that set of rhymes is a static set that doesn't change. And as we move forward in history, it becomes more and more important for dictionary users to have access to that information because it's not simply obvious by how something is pronounced. So let's take a look at a sample entry from the Kangxi Zidian so you can get an idea of what it looks like. Here's a page, and I know it's really tiny. You can actually find this online. The URL is right there at the bottom of the slide. And I've chosen here the page that has the same character, kuchi, or mouth, that we were looking at before. But because this is so tiny, I'm going to zoom in at just that beginning part of the entry. So again, we see here an early calligraphic form of the character. And then we have the block script version of the character. Oh, before I even get there, I should say it does point out that this is under that particular radical, which may go without saying, but there it is. It shows us other forms that character might have taken in other texts, other calligraphic forms. And then it goes immediately into the pronunciation. And I'm going to be explaining that on the next slide, how I know that's the pronunciation. But one of the other things that's really interesting is it gives us more than one pronunciation. So we've got this here is one of them. And this here is another. And if we went further down, we'd find there is probably a few more. Why is that? Well, just how there's different onyomi in Japanese, there are different possible pronunciations of Chinese characters depending on who, at what point, who, where, and when that pronunciation was being produced. And we're going to see examples of that all the way up into more modern dictionaries. And then after that, the rest of the entry gives us examples from other texts of how that character was used. Okay. So let me explain how the pronunciation thing works, the flip kutsen system. To show the pronunciation of an unknown character, one would cut the initial consonant from a second character and the rhyme, the last half, from a third, and then combine the second and the third to show the reading of the first. Let me use English as an example first, and then I'll give an example in Chinese. So, what if you wanted to represent the sound of the word tough? Well, you could do that by using two other words, ton and cuff, because ton begins with a t sound, and cuff ends with an uff sound. So if we take the t and the uff and put it together, we end up with tough. Admittedly, this method was a bit circular in that it required knowledge of the pronunciations of the characters that were cut, but it proved to be a workable system, and it actually lasted well into the 20th century. When you think about it, in the case of Chinese, there isn't an easy go-to phonetic system such as there is in Japanese with kana, and so they had to find a way to do this, and this really did seem to work pretty well. Let's look at a Chinese example. For example, this character, in Japanese higashi, but in Chinese is dong, is represented in the flip cut system with these three characters. So every time you look in a dictionary entry, whenever you see the this character, setsu, or kiru, you know that that is a flip-cut spelling. So you go to the first character and you cut off, if you will, the consonant sound of it. And then you go to the second character and you cut off the rhyme of it. So in this case, this character is pronounced in Chinese dong. And so we take the d sound from this, which is pronounced de, and the rhyme from this, which is pronounced hong or ong, okay? And we end up with dong. In this case, dong, it has to be a first tone. The other thing that we might look for, one other thing we might look for in an entry is citations of earlier usages. And when we take a look at Motohashi's dictionary next, you'll see examples of these sorts of earlier usages. And I was just pointing them out also in the Kangxi dictionary entry. So why have these citations of earlier usages? Well, you want to know who used what word in what way, because that helps you understand its definition. So in the lack, or with the lack of definition in the dictionary, earlier usages are kind of like the next best thing. They are different from definitions because it shows how a character has been used in the past by quoting famous texts, but it does not tell you specifically the interpretation of what that character is supposed to mean in that context. That would be up to the scholar himself to determine. The third thing we'd expect in a traditional Chinese dictionary entry would be the rhyme. Most forms of Chinese poetry require a rhyme, but there were two issues revolving around that, as I said. There's regional variation in pronunciation. How it's pronounced in the north might be different than the south. And of course, there's historical change over time. So that modern or semi-modern Chinese scholar who's working in poetry might not see or hear the rhyme, obviously, just pronouncing a character the way that he used it or heard it in a daily way, on a daily basis, within his context. However, it might be, and indeed linguists theorize, that at some point in history, those characters did rhyme. And indeed, when we think about it, English is parallel. English has experienced the same sorts of changes. So for example, we spell the word move, M-O-V-E, and that does not rhyme with love, L-O-V-E. But we spell them the same way, which is kind of weird. And if you think about it, you might wonder, gee, why is that? Is it just that English spelling is simply odd and there's nothing we can do about it? Well, maybe, but another reason might be that at some point in the history of the language, those two words did rhyme, and so it made sense to spell them the same way. But now, many years later, they have morphed, they have evolved, and we don't pronounce them in a rhyming fashion any longer. Now, for us, it's not a big deal because the rhyme in English poetry is important, but not as important as it is in Chinese poetry. So, what about these rhymes? There were dictionaries organized by rhyme, and these were important for poets. The most prominent of these dictionaries is probably the Pei Wen Yunfu, which was published in 1711. Pei Wen Yunfu means storehouse of rhymes from the literary adornment studio. It's kind of a mouthful. It's easier to say Pei Wen Yunfu. This is the greatest of a long line of rhyme compilations. It's by no means the first, but it's sort of the go-to resource now for sinologists. And it's ordered by rhyme category, not by radical. So in this scheme, there are 106 different rhyme categories, and you would look up a particular character according to its rhyme, not according to its modern, from your context, pronunciation, or by how it looks on the page, what radicals it has, or anything like that. What does the Pei Wen Yunfu include? It includes phrases and examples of these characters, how they were used in earlier texts. Notably, in Meiji Japan, some kanji dictionaries were organized in this same way according to the Chinese rhyme, because the Japanese, even though they're not Chinese speakers, were familiar with Chinese poetry and this long tradition of studying Chinese poetry. And so it came naturally to them to organize their dictionaries according to the rhyme. Let's take a look at a page from the Peiwen Yunfu. Here we have the character at the top, east, higashi in Japanese, dong in Chinese. And then we see the pronunciation. You see that this character right here, the setsu. So that tells us, oh, those are the two characters, and that's our example, of course. De and hong put together, dong. That tells us how it's pronounced. And then what the entry does is it gives us many, I'm going to highlight them here, many entries of combinations that end with east. So it's kind of counterintuitive. We're used to using Nelson's, where we're always looking for characters, for compounds that begin with a certain character. But the Peiwen Yunfu is organized according to rhyme, and so these entries all end. The second character, the rhyming character, is the important one. They all end with whatever character it is that section is dedicated to. So let's hop over the pond and into Japan and talk a little bit about dictionaries in Japan. That most certainly is not the full history of dictionaries in China, but I wanted to give you at least that much so that you could understand why we see what we do see in these modern Japanese dictionaries. So in the Meiji period, new vocabulary is coming out of the woodwork. And it's not just because there's lots of foreign loan words coming in. As a matter of fact, foreign loan words were kind of unusual in the Meiji period, in that what happens is not simply an adaptation of a word, an approximation of its pronunciation and its use, which is what we're familiar with today, but rather a foreign concept coming into Japan, and the Japanese deciding that they needed to coin their own word for that concept. So it's a little bit of a hackneyed example, but I'll use it anyway. The word shakai, society, was a word that was created during the Meiji period, because this was a concept that the Westerners had introduced to Japan, and the Japanese didn't have a word for it. So they thought about what it meant, and they thought about what characters to use, and that's what they chose. Curiously, there's a lot of words like this that the Japanese coined using kanji, and then the Chinese borrowed. It's almost like reverse borrowing across the pond. So in the Meiji period, these new vocabulary words are being created all the time. There's a real need, given the new exposure to the West, to have this kind of growing lexicon. And the people who were using these words, who were dealing with Western concepts, really felt a need for an authoritative dictionary that would help them manage all these new words. The organization of dictionaries in the Meiji period was either by kanji or phonetically. Actually, there's some that are done by poetics too. So it's kind of it's a mishmash of what organization people chose. And if the dictionary were organized phonetically, it was often done so according to the Iroha system. I'm hoping you remember the Iroha system. If you don't, go back and review the lecture on simplification right at the end. There's a few slides on the Iroha system. Okay, let me go over a couple examples from the Meiji period and show you some screenshots of their pages. The Genkai, the Sea of Words, was published in 1891. This was modeled actually on Webster's dictionary, on a Western dictionary, not on a Chinese model, and it was organized according to the Goju Onzu. So here's the first page, and as you would expect, it begins with A, because the Goju Onzu is A, I, U, E, O. I know that's really small, so let's zoom in on just the top part. And I know that's super fuzzy, but I'll try and point out what I want you to see. So we have A here at the top of the page, and then it tells us that this is the first kana in the A column of the Goju Onzu. I like that sort of circular reference. And it gives other explanations about what is, and then there's further entries. Here's one of my favorites, a. And it was usually written in the Meiji period in kana, in those kana. And it's an expression, it's an exhortation, right? Okay, so this is what the Genkai looked like. Very different than the Chinese examples that we were just taking a look at. Here's another Meiji example, the Wakan Gazoku Iroha Den. This was published in 1888, and it included a lot of technical terms, and its organization was based on the Iroha, which you can probably guess from the title, not according to the Goju Onzu. Here's the first page. And so it begins with E. This is the other E. That's why I say it's modified according to the Iroha, because actually I think that needs to come elsewhere, but they decided to stick it together because the sound by the Meiji period is indistinguishable. So in this case, it gives us some of the Manyogana that could go with that. You see that over here also, and then a definition, and they also give us, starting here, the part of speech, in this case a noun, right? And definitions very much like what you'd expect from a Western dictionary. No harkening back to the Chinese example or anything like that. Here's another example, the Nihon Daijisho. The Nihon Daijisho was published in 1892 and edited by a man named Yamada Bimyo. Yamada Bimyo was a fiction writer, but also a distinguished author of nonfiction also. And what makes this particular dictionary interesting is that it was the first one to indicate accent. The accent of a word, or the pitch, sometimes people say, was a new recognition for Japanese linguists. And this particular dictionary gives it to us. Where do we see that? We see that here, for example, where it says hei, heiwa no hei, or taira, even, right, as in an even pitch. So that's just a few examples of the form that dictionaries took in the Meiji period. And if you've done the extra reading for this lesson, I think it's chapter 7, which is available as a PDF on Blackboard, then you'll see some other books mentioned, but you'll get a good idea of what those early Meiji works looked like. I'm going to leap forward yet again and bring you to today. Why am I telling you all this stuff? For a couple reasons. One is I want you to understand what you're going to see in modern kanji dictionaries and why. But the other reason is that I want to remind you, if you already knew it, or tell you if you didn't, that in Japanese studies, when you sit down to buy your reference books, there's really a need for 2, not 1 dictionary. Now for this course, I only required you to purchase Nelson's, which is a kanji dictionary. But a kanji dictionary, even a good one like Nelson's, is not the end-all and be-all for you. And the reason why is that there are plenty of words that are not written in kanji, and there are plenty of greater details that Nelson's won't provide for you. And for that, you'll need a Kokugo Jiten, or a Japanese dictionary. Most students, if they're at the first or the second year level, will not use a Kokugo Jiten very happily. They'd much rather be using a bilingual dictionary, and that's fine. To use a Wa Jiten, a Japanese English dictionary, is a natural step for a student, but the more advanced you get, the more important it is to see the Kokugo Jiten as your friend. You really have to use both these dictionaries as you're pursuing your studies, depending on your particular needs. Our library at the University of Albany has both of these, and I would assume that any SUNY campus library would have at least 1 or 2 choices in both of these categories. Modern dictionaries include definitions as well as other information, and so the rest of today's lesson I want to be focusing on what dictionaries you'll find when you go over to the library and what to expect from those entries in greater detail than what we have looked at so far in Chinese history. I'm going to start with kanji dictionaries. Motohashi's Daikan Wajiten and the Kokan Wajiten are the most comprehensive kanji dictionaries. In particular, the Daikan Wajiten is seen as the ultimate dictionary, even by sinologists. This is the ultimate dictionary, the most comprehensive work of its kind. There is, by the way, a Chinese version of this. The initial version of it was edited by this man named Motohashi Tetsuji, which is why we call it Motohashi, and then after that was produced and published, then there was a Chinese translation of that dictionary also produced. And so sinologists tend to use that Chinese version. It's easier for them. But the whole thing originated with this scholar, Motohashi. I want to give credit where credit is due. Motohashi provides us with a mixture of old and new materials in its entry, more old than new. And the entry we're going to take a closer look at is really designed for the sinologist. I'm not really expecting my students to use Motohashi much at all. But I do spend a lot of time on it in this class for a couple reasons. One is because I think you ought to know what the authoritative dictionaries are in your field. And the other is that unless you have a little bit of an introduction to it, just knowing that it's there is still going to leave it kind of daunting to you. So I'm going to try and make it a little bit more user-friendly in my explanations. Now, for most students, an alternative to the Daikan Wajiten is the Kokan Wajiten. This is a sort of modernized, abridged version of Motohashi. Now, both of these dictionaries are multi-volume. Motohashi has 12 volumes plus an index volume. And we're going to take a look at that, a closer look at that in the next lesson. And the Kokan Wajiten has, I think it's 4 volumes. So these are not the sorts of works that I would expect students to go out and buy. They're extremely expensive. But they are works that your library will have. If you are at Stony Brook or Binghamton, they have copies of Motohashi. I'm not sure about the Kokan Wajiten. If you're at Buffalo, I know there's a Kokan Wajiten there. If you can't find what you're looking for, and sometimes it can be tricky, you might want to just go to the reference desk of your library, your local library, and ask the librarian for help. Okay, let's look at an entry, a typical entry for Motohashi, and see how it harkens back to Chinese history, but also has some new, more clearly presented information. Here's a scan of the page that has this character hiro or ko, hiroi, okay, on it. So let me walk you through this really quickly. Here's the complex character, and it doesn't give us the simplified character. Why? Because Motohashi was published prior to 1945, and so it began to be published prior to 1945, and so it is it's not concerned with the simplified version of the characters. It gives us a discrete number because, just like Nelson's, every kanji in Motohashi has a discrete number. And then it gives us 3 different pronunciations. Now you may be looking at this thinking, right, what the heck is that? It looks like kuau, which sounds like an injured cat. But you got to remember that this is published before 1945. And so what we see here is the Q kanazukai. So this is not kuau, it's ko. And indeed, if you looked up this character in Nelson's, you discovered that it's onyomi. But we don't just have one column with that reading, we have 3. And they're identical in Japanese, but they're not. Look down here in Chinese. We see that character for the flip cut, which means that these are distinct readings, 3 different distinct readings, possible distinct readings in Chinese, depending on who was writing it and when they were writing it. Okay. This down here, the box with the little circle in it, is the rhyme. So there's 3 separate rhymes, possible rhymes. And then this here is the romanization of the modern pronunciation, Guang. And this, in the Chinese Juyin Fuhao system, is also that modern pronunciation. What's missing? Kunyomi, hello, Kunyomi, where are you? Not there, is it? That's one of the first things that really surprises students. You're not going to find the kunyomi here. Why? Because Motohashi is only concerned with sinology. He's not concerned with a Japanese pronunciation. If we look further into the entry, like right here, we see hiroi, but that's not a reading, that's not a kunyomi, that's a definition. We can tell it's a definition because it doesn't indicate that the E, separate from the hiro, that the E is the okurigana. And also here we see hiro ba, right? These are definitions. What else does it give us, this entry? It gives us a early calligraphic form. It tells us that this is a lesser seal script form. And then it goes into examples. We have category 1, subsection 1, subsection 2, subsection 3, and then, here's our old friend, the iroha, I, no, ha, ni. And if I had continued on with that entry, you would have seen more, okay? So the iroha is here being used as an ordinal system, and we'll revisit that when we do ordinals in another couple lessons, okay? But what else do we get? So we get a description of what it might mean, and then immediately quotations from the Chinese. Here's the shuowen. He tells us, Motohashi tells us what it says in the shuowen under that character. And so what follows, these next 4 lines, 4.5, is classical Chinese. Really, realistically, this is not going to be very useful to you as a student of modern Japanese. But I want you to understand why it's there. I'm hoping you can think back to the beginning of this lecture when I said that Chinese scholars, sinologists, were in need of these earlier references, and likewise Motohashi was a sinologist, so for him this is really important information, and so that's what he's doing. He's providing that for you. Really, the stuff in Motohashi that for you as a student is going to be the most useful, you'll probably find more toward the end of entries. And I'll say more about that in detail in the next lesson when we talk about Motohashi. I just wanted to give you a basic overview of what that entry of Motohashi looks like. Now, for comparison, let's look at that same entry in the abbreviated Kokan Wajiten. Here's the character, and the Kokan Wajiten is published after 1945, so we get the simplified version, and then at the bottom of the page, we get the complex version. It tells us that this is the radical plus 2 residual strokes here, or the radical plus 12 residual strokes here. It also has a distinct discrete number for both of them. And here it tells us it's part of the Joyo kanji. And then we have both the kunyomi and the onyomi, and of course, because it's post 1945, this is in the new kana, the new orthography. Okay, and if it is okurigana, it is in normal type, and if it's the reading of the character, it's in bold type. Very helpful. This section is largely the same as we saw in Motohashi. Okay, there's really nothing different going on there. That's pulled directly from Motohashi. And then this section likewise is the same as what we'd find in the original Motohashi, so we have that citation from the Shuowen, etc., etc. Okay, so the big difference here is that we're getting the kunyomi where we hadn't gotten it. We're getting the complex and the simplified, and we're switching from the Kyu Kanazukai to the modern kana usage. Now, what about one-volume dictionaries, not these multi-volume dictionaries, one-volume dictionaries? Single-volume kanji dictionaries are pretty common. They have similar entries, but they are really geared for modern users, modern native Japanese speakers. So I thought I'd show you an example from one that I have sitting on the shelf in my office. Same character, and you'll see where the overlap is with those classic dictionaries, okay? So we have the simplified form and the complex form, the radical, the residual stroke number, the category that it falls into according to the Japanese Ministry of Education. We have the onyomi. We have all the various kunyomi and the different okurigana. Those dots are there to indicate some inflections, which we haven't covered, but just in case you were wondering what they are. It gives us the stroke order here, which Motohashi would never give us. The assumption is, well, if you're using Motohashi, you must know what it is. And here it repeats some of that information that we got from Motohashi. And I think if you hadn't seen the entry from Motohashi, this section here wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense to you. Okay. Now this tells us that this is the kan-on reading of the character. And this tells us that this is the go-on reading of the character. And then below that we have additional kunyomi in case we missed it up here. Okay, so really this section that I'm circling is a tribute, if you will, to Motohashi, sort of a modified version of the information that we would find in Motohashi. But then afterwards, look, we're not getting examples from classical Chinese literature because the modern Japanese user isn't really in need of that. But what we're also kind of missing is we're missing a definition. All we're given are the different possible readings here, and then some synonyms, o-ki, for example, right, or usages in which it might have a parallel. But we don't see a definition like we would see, for example, in a Nelson's dictionary. Okay. There's some reference notes here and a little bit of comment on the character, how it's put together. This is a keisei emoji. If you recall, we talked about different kinds of kanji in the kanji trivia unit, so you can go back and take a look at the keisei emoji and how that would work together for this particular character. So this is a really different entry than what we saw in Motohashi. Let's do a side-by-side comparison. Here on the left is that one volume dictionary, and on the right is the Kokan Wajiten, which is sort of a halfway point, I guess, between Motohashi and a modern single volume dictionary. But you can see where on the left a lot of information has been pulled in from the Kokan Wajiten. And again, I think if you hadn't seen the Kokan Wajiten, you might not understand what exactly much of this stuff really is. And if we do a side-by-side comparison of the full part of the entry, the difference is striking. So on the right, the Kokan Wajiten gives us lots of information from the classics of Chinese, and on the left, those have all been dropped. Now what about non-kanji dictionaries? Those are just kanji dictionaries, but the other kind of dictionary that I mentioned was a Kokugo Jiten. There are lots of single volume Kokugo Jiten out there in the world, and I certainly have one. If you have a Denjiji show, you probably have one loaded on there, the Kojian, we've already talked about that. But the most authoritative one is called the Nihon Kokugo Daijiten. This is a multi-volume dictionary again, just like what we saw with Motohashi, but this one is a Kokugo Jiten. It's a Japanese dictionary. It's not a kanji dictionary. It has about 500,000 entries. I think of it as the Japanese OED, the Japanese Oxford English Dictionary, the ultimate authority in Japanese language. It is truly encyclopedic and multi-volume. It gives lots and lots of examples of how words have been used in modern Japan. Very little from, actually they also have examples from classical Japan, but it doesn't, the big difference between this and the kanji dictionaries is that this does not harken back to the Chinese classics. This is focused on the Japanese language. Our library has 2 editions of it here at the University at Albany. If you are at one of the university centers, I believe that there should be at least one version of it in your reference section. Here's an example of the entry for Hiroi from the Kokugo Daijiten. So what do we find? Well, we find the word, we find the dot that indicates how it inflects. And then we see the 4 different kanji that might be used to write hiroi depending on the context. Okay. There's a lot going on here. Let me annotate a little bit of it for you. First of all, see these subsections 1, 2, and 3. And then within those sections, just like what we saw in Motohashi, we have I and Ro, etc., etc. Okay? But to look even more closely at the entry, what do we have? Well, those are all the possible kanji, as I said, that the word can be written with, depending on the context. That next section gives us the part of speech in modern Japanese. This is an adjective. That K is from keiyoshi, the word for adjective. The next section gives us the part of speech and the inflection dot in classical Japanese. I won't belabor that point because I'm not teaching you classical Japanese, but anytime you see this little symbol, a bun, in there, then that's probably referring to classical Japanese. And then we get the definition of the word. Wow, this is the first place that we have seen a definition like that in a Japanese dictionary. I would be willing to bet that as a dictionary user, you might just take definitions as absolutely de rigueur. Of course, a dictionary has a definition. What dictionary wouldn't have a definition? Well, we've seen plenty now that don't, right? And we understand why. But here we get the definition and the meaning. One of the other things that this dictionary gives is here, where the asterisk is the first of many. Oh, sorry, right here it's the first one. The first of many citations back to Japanese literature, not Chinese literature. So the first example they have is from the Manyoshu. That's what the Manyo means. And then the second example they have is from the pillow book, Makura no Soshi. That's what the pillow, the makura there, means. When you become really familiar with classical Japanese literature, these abbreviations make perfect sense. But now, if you saw that and you didn't know what it was, you can always go to the beginning of the dictionary, and there's an annotation page that tells you what the abbreviations are. Okay, so that's what we would expect to find in a modern Kokugo Jiten. Let me finish up with bilingual dictionaries. These have their important usages, but they too are not the final answer, okay? And the reason why they're not the final answer is that most of these dictionaries, the good ones, are designed for native Japanese speakers who are studying English. They are not designed for people who are studying Japanese as a second language. They're not designed for gaijin. And so some of the things that you'd like to have as a, say, a native English speaker won't be there. That's why some students are tempted, and it's sad, but they're tempted at the beginning of their language learning career to buy a dictionary that has, for example, furigana underneath every kanji. And I can see that as something that, you see, oh, it'll make my life faster. But the furigana is there at a price. What it means is that you have fewer entries in the dictionary, and so the dictionary is very quickly outgrown by the student, and you got to go on and buy something better, okay? So you got to keep in mind that the bilingual dictionaries are made for Japanese speakers, and the other reason why this is important is that there are a number of words that native speakers absolutely take for granted, like des, that you may not find in a bilingual dictionary. And you think, my God, that's so basic. How could they not have des in the dictionary? And the answer is that the compilers of the dictionary cannot imagine a situation in which a native Japanese speaker would need to know how to say des in English. So here's the entry for hiroi. Okay. This dictionary, this is from the Kenkyusha YA Jiten, the one-volume Kenkyusha YA Jiten, which is generally considered the best YA Jiten on the market. It gives us the accent hiroi, right? It's not hiroi, it's hiroi. And it gives us the kanji, but just one. It doesn't give us others. Those may be in separate entries. It tells us the part of speech. It's an adjective. Incidentally, I didn't mention this before, but part of speech is absent in those entries we were looking at in early China. it gives us a definition, or actually not a definition, a translation. No definition, a translation. And then it goes on to give lots of examples marked by these little paragraph marks in which that word might be used and how to translate it. So mune ga hidoi would be broad of chest, for example. And one of the problems with this dictionary too, of course, is there's no furigana there. If you come across a kanji that you don't know, you have to then look up that separate one. And for a lot of students, that's just a lot of work. Now, the advent of electronic dictionaries makes much of this much faster. Let's say you were looking at this entry online and you were using Nikkei-kun. That would solve a lot of your problems right away. Okay. But certainly, this is a very different entry in terms of its content than what we saw in other types of dictionaries and also dictionaries from a different age. So when we talk about dictionaries, we're most certainly not talking about a monolithic entity. The next lesson will be about Morohashi's dictionary and the Kokanwa Jiten.